Okay, welcome back everybody, and thank you to West Fraser for sponsoring that networking break. I'd just like to remind everybody that we're going to be using Slido as our live question and answer tool. So please scan the QR code that'll be on the screen or on the question cards on your table, and we would be happy to have your questions. Or you can complete the question card that's sitting on your table. If you hold it up, somebody from our conference team will run around, make sure we get those up to our moderator. And again, just a friendly reminder to check out the Fur Canada silent auction in the Newcastle lobby. The auction is closing at 3:30 today, and we will be announcing the winners at 4:30. So now please join me in welcoming the panelists for our second panel, titled Watershed Restoration and the Restoration Economy, moderated by Barb, Marine Planning Coordinator at Nanwakolas Council. Thank you.
Testing. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for returning from the refreshment break. As you can tell, I am not Dallas, and I will not be going overtime. At least that is my hope for today. Thank you, Logan, for the introduction. As he said, my name is Barb Dinning. I'm Marine Planning Coordinator at Nanwakolas Council. I work with each and every one of our member First Nations on shipping and marine transportation and protection and conservation initiatives, and also work closely with our Crown partners in building partnerships and collaborations with all things that our nations are interested in their territories. So very interested and privileged today to moderate this panel with these illustrious guests beside me. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but I'll just start with just giving their names and their titles, and then I will ask them to each give a brief description of your organization, the work you and your teams do with respect to the restoration economy, and why it's important. So first we have Jordan Point, the Executive Director of the First Nation Fisheries Council. Welcome. Parliamentary Secretary Finn Donnelly from Watershed Restoration for the Government of BC. And Jason Hwang, I hope I pronounced that all right, Chief Program Officer for the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So welcome everyone, and I'll pass the torch over to Jordan.
Thank you, Barb. I just wanted to, in our language, in our way, I just wanted to say HOL, CM, Siaya, Ait Tanishqualawan, Wananu Ait Tanishqualawan, E Quans, Quatsnala, Ait Sepka, to Snunaimuch, Mustimuch, Hwang people. And what I'm saying is that I bring good thoughts in my mind, good feelings in my heart for this work that we're doing here today, raising my hands to the proud people of Snunaimuch Nation. So thank you all for being here today. You wanted a brief introduction about what we do? So I'm the Executive Director of the First Nations Fisheries Council, and I've been in that role for approximately 14 years, close to 15 years now. And we received our mandate from the Fisheries Council in a time of, there was the time of the new relationship. And the Leadership Council of the day was mandating the creation of the Energy and Mining Council, Forestry Council, Fisheries Council, and other councils that work on behalf of First Nations in the province at a regional scale. And our mandate is, you can find it on the webpage, it's the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan. It has 6 themes and over 70 recommendations that the Chiefs in Assembly came together and identified priorities that they, and aspirations and areas of concern, matters of broad concern that they wanted addressed. And we took that as our guiding fundamental action plan. And I always kid people that, you know, when I took on the job, that if I had $100 million and about 75 employees, I might be able to get through half of that, those recommendations. So the work still lives. We still use the action plan as a guide, and it helps to guide the work that we do. And I think that for those of you that aren't familiar with the Fisheries Council, we have 14 geographic regions across the province, and we have a council table, and we don't call them representatives, we call them regional delegates. Many of you know, if you work with First Nations, that there are hereditary processes, traditional processes, elected processes, delegated processes, independent processes, modern-day treaty processes. So I say all that to say it's a complex environment. Government is complex, fish are complex, First Nations are complex, with all of these different moving pieces in the conversation. The Fisheries Council, we really recognized at the start, we embraced something that I indicated earlier, that the Leadership Council was forming these sector-based councils. In 2010, there was a report done, a study, they called it the All Chiefs Task Force. And they were checking in to say, well, we've created these councils, how are we performing? And one of the products that came out of that report was, well, we're probably not doing as well as we could be doing because we continue as First Nations to speak in a fragmented voice. And so our charge coming out of the All Chiefs Task Force report was to build structure and processes that would enable and assist nations to speak in a coherent manner back to government. So the work that we've done over the last 14, 15 years is really about building structure, process, and implementing kind of supports to nations in the regions and the watersheds to help develop coherent messaging to government. One of the principles of reconciliation and UNDRIP, DRIPA, and this is for those of you that are new to the game, some of you have been around, but you know, talking like the language of you know, my kids, here's a cheat code. You know what a cheat code is? It's a way to get through the next stage of things, and here's something that you can take away. The fundamental element of what we're trying to accomplish is recognizing that nations have the right to be brought into the room to talk about decision-making that affects their rights, and they also have the fundamental right to structure institutions to support that decision-making. So creating an environment, whether you're in government, whether you're in non-government, whether you're in private business, if you recognize, hey, we're going to make decisions that affect those nations. I was thinking about that when Dallas and I were talking about the forestry work. Bringing people into the room, hey, this is going to affect them, their rights. We should bring them in and talk about these things in advance. So that's how you get to that free, prior, and informed consent. So what we've been doing over the last number of years is working with our colleagues on that type of business model. And so I just wanted to kind of give a high-level overview of what we've been doing with the First Nations Fisheries Council. The reason why this is relevant is because it creates a world of opportunity. Collaboration, partnership, and building stable, predictable business models and working with other partners and colleagues creates a world of opportunity. So I'm giving a bit of a long introduction, but in the pre-call we said I'll give a bit of a context about some of the work that we've been doing with both the provincial government and with the Pacific Salmon Foundation on creating a new environment in terms of salmon restoration, watershed protection, and some of the work that we're doing with all of those things that affect fish. People ask, why is the Fisheries Council in some of these conversations? Because what happens on land usually ends up in the watersheds, in the water, and it's affecting fish. So that's why we have a vested interest in this. You see in our action plan, theme 3 is about safeguarding habitat and responding to threats. So that's why we see ourselves in this mix at the table. So I'll pause there because I know we'll probably talk, but I'll pass it on to Finn. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Barb, for the intro. And also want to thank Sanemu First Nation for being on their traditional territory, and also for the welcoming last night. I thought the kids, the singing and in their language was so powerful, and it was a lovely reception to come into the territory. So I do want to acknowledge that, along with the conference organizers for putting this together and bringing all of you into this room. And thank you, Dallas. And also I should acknowledge the elder that started us off in a good way this morning. So, Hajka Osiam. My name is Finn Donnelly. I'm the MLA for Coquitlam Burke Mountain. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary for Watershed Restoration. A little bit of background. My Squamish name is Iem Yoyos, which means strong swimmer in the animal world, and I was honored to get that name in 1997 after I swam the length of the Fraser River, which is the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. It was a 1,400-kilometer swim down the longest river in BC, and the Squamish recognized that effort and brought me into their family. And I wear that name with a lot of honor and responsibility. And the elders gave that name to me because of my work with salmon. And they said, Orca need healthy populations of salmon to feed on. So that's a huge responsibility because since that swim, our salmon populations have been in decline. So I am still on that life path of working to turn that trend around. But I wear that name, Iem Yoyos, with a large degree of responsibility. I'm also a former member of Parliament, so I spent 10 years in Ottawa. I'm a former city councillor in Coquitlam. That's where I got my start in public policy, 7 years as a city councillor. And currently I represent the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, so affectionately known as Walrus. And so what does Walrus focus on? So one of the areas we're working on in terms of supporting the development of the restoration economy is through watershed restoration. So we have a number of strategies that since 2020 we've been working on: the watershed security strategy, a wild salmon strategy, and a coastal marine strategy. You heard earlier as well, in the bigger context of what the province has been doing on the first panel with Tom and other comments about what the province has been doing to set the context to allow us to get to the strategies that we're currently developing. And they are being co-developed with First Nations in British Columbia. So I think it's critical to work on these areas because we are seeing increasing wildfires, floods, drought, so many problems that are intensifying and making it hard to predict how we plan to move forward in a good way. So I think that we really need to work on how do we reverse these trends that we're seeing that are impacting salmon, wildlife, some populations. We want to turn the corner and turn that around. But we have to do that recognizing that we're going to see, likely, intensified storms, wildfires, floods, droughts. I mean, we have a very low snowpack. We're going to go into another summer, likely, of lower water. So these are real challenges. So that's what's motivating me, and I believe, and Jordan put it very eloquently, that we need processes working with nations, recognizing rights and title, to get to real solutions that are going to restore ecosystems, watersheds, in order to move forward for a prosperous future. I believe that is the only way forward, and we have to find ways to do that effectively in order to have productive, resilient communities. So I think a restoration economy is absolutely critical in bringing jobs, training, and opportunity to that resilient future that we're looking for.
Well, thank you, Barb, Finn, and Jordan, and it's my pleasure to be here. I'm Jason Hwang. I'm with Pacific Salmon Foundation. I'd like to thank Nanaimo Nation for welcoming us, and Chief Lawley or Elder Lawley for that welcome this morning, and also like to thank Dallas and the C3 team for inviting us. And I think some people in this room might be wondering, restoration economy, what is that? You know, and Pacific Salmon Foundation, what is a group like that doing here in a room with people like us? And hopefully through what we share with you on the panel today, we'll give you some insight and maybe plant a few seeds to think about things a little bit differently. And I think that's going to be a theme for this conference, and things that we might be able to do into the future. And I think that's kind of what Jordan and Finn have set up for us in the panel, and I'll kind of pick it up from there. So Pacific Salmon Foundation is a non-government organization, and I'm not going to go through everything that we do, but in the short strokes, we try to do good things we can for salmon to help salmon be resilient, sustainable, recover where they're in trouble. And as a small nonprofit organization, we have no mandate, we have no authority, but we do have capacity, enthusiasm, relationships, and great people to work with. And so that's how we try to operate. And our connections to salmon and this idea of a restoration economy it's a connection, and it's a connection to everything. As Jordan and Finn were indicating in their opening comments, you don't take salmon and separate them from a watershed. You don't separate what happens in terms of economic development from what happens in a watershed, and then in reverse, you can't separate that from what happens with salmon. These things are all interconnected, and we can't put them in compartments and just try to manage them independently. And so when I started my career in the fisheries business, restoration used to be kind of a nice to do. There was all this other stuff going on, and it was a little thing in the corner, and you did it, and we all felt good about it. And we should still do that. But things have changed. Our watersheds, our ecosystems, our salmon populations, our communities are under stress. The combined effects of everything that we've done in the past, the things we continue to do, the things that are coming at us from climate change, are changing things like we have never seen before. And so restoration, I think you're going to hear from us, is not a nice to do anymore. It's a have to do. We have to do more of it, we have to invest in it seriously, and we have to do it forever into the future if we want to try to sustain our natural resources and sustain the economies and the lifestyles and the values that we have and that we're responsible for. And things for salmon, things for the people that depend on salmon, things for the ecosystems that depend on salmon have declined rapidly on our watch. And let me just give you one example in my personal experience. When I started as a professional, the early Stewart sockeye run that runs up the Fraser River, past Prince George, Fort St. James to Takla territory, used to be about 800,000 early Stewart sockeye. That was in about 1993. In 2021, on the same 4-year cycle, that run was down to 50,000 fish. That's a 94% decline while I've been a professional. This is not some idea that happened a long time ago. We're not talking about extinction of the dodo bird or extinction of the dinosaurs. We're talking about losing a precious natural resource right here, right now, right before our eyes. And this, to me, is a reason that we need to start thinking about the restoration economy, taking it seriously, and looking at it as an opportunity. Because it's not just about salmon. If you restore salmon, you restore opportunities to fish, you restore economy, you restore Aboriginal opportunity and rights and cultural experiences that we are losing. And so I'll leave that as an opening, and then Barb, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. That's a lot to unpack. Okay, panel's over. No, I just want to pick up on a few key points that I'm hearing and that involve my everyday in my career. I heard this morning about the intense forestry activities over the past 100 years, and that is in decline. However, the results of that intense forestry is evident everywhere. You talk about the salmon populations in serious decline. There are so many stressors that affect our environment, environmental stressors as well as human stressors. So I like what you say, that it's not a nice thing to do anymore, it's critical. And it's critical for Indigenous communities, but it's also critical for all people. We all depend on healthy ecosystems. If it's not healthy, we're not gonna strive, we're not gonna thrive. So I want to pick up on those topics for sure. They're very key. The first question I was thinking about was, you know, we heard this morning about partnerships, collaborations, involving Indigenous nations at the table, decision-making power at the table. So I'd like to hear some examples of partnerships you're currently involved in that you want to highlight today, and you know, what are opportunities you see to advance this restoration economy? So I'll start with you.
Start with me? Okay. Yeah, good question. I think in terms of like moving the dial forward, of course, you can see the relationship that we've started to talk about between different organizations, different levels of government. One of the things that you can probably observe is that you've heard from First Nations this teaching. We call it our Snuith, our teaching. And that is, all things are connected. So whether we're talking about what happens in forestry, what happens in land, talks about water, these things all have impacts, and ultimately the threads come back to fundamental things that overlap. And so we recognized early on that in order for us to make a dent, we have to work together, we have to collaborate together. That's what this shared domain is, that we go, all these things are connected, and we got to start working together on solving these things. The environment that most of us operate in, of course, we're dealing with, I talked earlier about the ways nations are structured, but we're also dealing with a lot of legislative kind of initiatives, whether we're dealing with self-government agreements, reconciliation framework agreements, modern day treaties, just assertion of rights. And then there's the competing jurisdiction in non-Indigenous communities, where you're dealing with federal, provincial, municipal jurisdiction and authority that has to be kind of like considered and thought through. And then there's the business world that has all of its pressures, and I think that the urgency of the economy and pressuring. So it's really important to be able to build a stable, predictable environment to make decisions, and something that is thoughtful and meets the nations where they want to be met and talked about. So we started a long time ago taking, as I indicated earlier, the All Chiefs Task Force report to say we got to build structure and process that helps nations advance their interests, their aspirations, their rights in a coherent manner. Because a lot of people, some of you probably in the room, I've heard it over the years, you know, my partner, she's Italian, and she always wants me, and worst of all, she's a grade 2 teacher, so she always wants me to explain everything right from the start. And so I have to kind of think about, okay, how do I explain this? And the need for us to be building structures to move the conversation forward is going to require us being thoughtful about how do we build that stable environment? How do we take all of these people with different aspirations, the nations, the different processes? People want to know, how do we do this? And so I gave you the cheat code. It's, hey, if you're going to make a decision that's going to affect a nation that you're working with, or in your local community or area, then just reach out and start talking. Start building the relationship. Start to say, hey, how can we work together? Conversely, This is critical. Nations have to work together to be able to get themselves to the table in a meaningful way so that they can bring their jurisdiction and authority to the table in a meaningful way. So it's a two-part conversation. It's not just up to government or municipalities or NGOs to reach out to the nations. The nations have to do some work and collaborate with one another about how do we get our message across. Fish are migratory, water moves, and it crosses jurisdiction. It's not good enough to just say this is our territory and this is our right, because the fish are going to swim right by. And I've asked people over the years, okay, you got a fishing plan. Did you talk to the nation upriver? No. Did you talk to the people on the coast about as those fish? No. So how do you know those fish are going to be there in your plan if you're not talking to those other groups? So it's really about starting to develop structured conversations amongst the nations so that they can engage at the table in a thoughtful way. So we have a business model at the Fisheries Council that we kind of have a three-part type kind of like cycle. So we convene, we call all the nations that we think, hey, is this important to you? We'll have forums around the province. We'll convene them. We'll elicit their interests. What are your priorities? Then we'll distill that into discussion papers, positions, and then we start to go through and we'll bring it back and say, this is what we heard, is that right? Then we have that's done in a tier 1 environment with just the nations. We invite government into a tier 2 forum where the nations can meet with government and start to talk about that. Then government has to take it away and kind of think, okay, how do we fit that? How do we make it work? So we've been doing this over, like I said, 14 years, developing this process. It starts to become a regular muscle memory kind of process. And then we start to develop more structured engagement with government, because now they say, oh, geez, now we understand this. But then we have to develop ongoing and enduring processes. You just don't do this once. It's got to be going over year after year after year. So now you have to get government to change its mechanics, moving away from their existing programs and start to develop strategic partnerships. And so we've developed what we call our Commitment to Action Accords. And in the Commitment to Action Accords, we structure a joint executive process, a joint steering committee process. We have committees that talk about specific subject matters. But at least that way now we can come back to the table on a regular basis with different levels of government, different partners, and have the commitment at the executive level. And we're talking about whether that's ministries and departments of the federal government and or other partners. We've just done this with the Real Estate Foundation of BC, developing this joint process, because it's important to keep this conversation going in a structured format. And so we've been utilizing this process for about 10 years, the C2A process. And so that's kind of like our secret sauce in building these partnerships and building enduring and structured conversations, that we get that kind of cycle going with the nations, how they put in their concerns, whether it's fish, whether it's water, and engaging on the activities that are important to them. Of course, this is a diverse conversation. What happens in the Columbia River and in a Soyuz territory is going to be completely different than what's happening in the North Coast and Haida Gwaii. So lots of just different conversations happening, but trying at a provincial scale to bring that in to inform legislation, policy, practices. It's a big conversation, but we've had great success working with the province and with the Pacific Salmon Foundation on something we call the Pacific Salmon Action Dialogue Series. And we've been doing that for about 4 years now. And it started off saying, geez, as Jason indicated, we're starting to see a terrific and horrific decline of Pacific salmon. What are we going to do? And if we're going to do anything, it's going to take all of us. And it's going to take a big, large conversation. So we've been developing this partnership and relationship with all levels of government and NGOs and First Nations in this conversation. So I'll stop, because I could talk for hours on this stuff. So I'll pass it over.
I'll just jump in. I think Jordan really highlighted the importance of working with nations and gave away a little of his secret sauce, and I think, and also talked about the mechanics and of process and good governance to building those strong enduring partnerships. So I think that's absolutely critical. One of the things that the province has done to ensure that that is in all of our land use processes or stewardship agreements is now with DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, it's legislated that we, the province, has to do that. So I think that this is not, again, as Jason mentioned with restoration, it's not a nice to do, this is a must do. We are legally obligated to do that. So now with that mandate, you can, I think, go forward with what Jordan has pointed out is how do you establish those partnerships? Well, it's based on good governance, and that's how you work together. I'll just give a couple of examples in the restoration world, where First Nations and Indigenous-led organizations have been funded to restore watersheds and support recovery of salmon and other fish. So here's a couple of examples. 2.7 million was provided to the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance for freshwater salmon habitat assessment and restoration planning on the Central Coast, including improving hydrological stability and increasing resilience to climate change. And also 1.5 million was provided to Stolo Service Agency to support restoration and management planning for gill bar in the Fraser River, alongside technical professionals from Sotomuk Stewardship Alliance. And I do want to just finish with going where Jordan highlighted, and where probably Jason might comment on, and that's the Pacific Salmon Action Dialogues series. And I think the partnership between the First Nation Fisheries Council and Pacific Salmon Foundation, which I think I'm going to say, I hope, began with a conversation with the province about the need of how we tackle salmon recovery, is an excellent example of where you're tackling a complex problem, working together, not choosing the easy path of just, you can just throw money at it and hope that it works, but to say what is the established governance process that's going to actually address all these different areas, all these different territories in the province in a enduring way. And I think the roadmap, the salmon recovery roadmap that PSF and FNFC have developed is absolutely illustrative of a partnership of showing the way to government of how to make that happen. So I am looking forward to continuing to work in partnership to see that implemented.
It's kind of nice in a way going third, because I get to kind of just ride the coattails of the awesome comments of Jordan and Finn. But I'll just build briefly on this thread. The Salmon Action Dialogues that Jordan and Finn have spoken about, for those of you that aren't in our world of salmon, it's really important to understand this one thing. There is no comprehensive plan for salmon. If you say, who's in charge and what's the plan, and show me the top 10 priorities, you'd think every new fisheries minister would show up and just be able to get that binder and you'd see it. There's no such thing. And that is the root of the problem. And that is what we are trying to identify, but not just identify, solve. And it's not solving with rocket science. It's solving with relatively basic business plans, business principles, and things that we could implement almost immediately if we choose to. So there's potential there. And I used an analogy to describe this at the First Nations Fisheries Council Spring Assembly a few weeks ago. I said, it's like we've got a room right now of people and soccer balls. And in that room, there are some world-class soccer players. But just having them standing there in a room with a soccer ball doesn't mean you've got a world-class soccer team. You've got to organize. You have to have a plan. You have to agree to work together, and then you have to go out there and take on the world. So we've got the potential to do this, but we are not organized to activate, and we're losing assets every day because we're not taking advantage of that. And I'm just gonna quote some stats here, because part of the homework we've done on these Salmon Action Dialogues is we've looked at what they're doing in Washington State, and on some things they're behind us, but on some things they're ahead of us. And they've been investing in their salmon restoration economy for some time. So for every $1 million invested in watershed restoration, it generates 15 to 33 new or sustained jobs, resulting in 2.2 to 2.5 million in total economic activity. Since their model was launched 20 plus years ago, it's created $650 million in economic activity and employed 2,000 plus people per year, and improved more than 25,000 acres of salmon habitat, fixed more than 3,700 fish passage barriers, and reconnected more than 4,750 miles of freshwater habitat. We can do that here. A salmon recovery economy can employ people, it can reverse declines, and it can set the stage for improved economic activity and improve resiliency of our watersheds, our salmon, and our communities.
Thank you. That's a lot of stats. I wanted to touch on governance for a minute. And when I think about good governance and what exactly that means, I do hear it in all of what you've contributed so far. But I'd like to hear a little bit more in your words, you know, just from an Indigenous community perspective. I'm not Indigenous, I will say that up front, but I'm a little biased because that's who I serve. How do you see the importance of their decision-making in their territories, not just around, you know, extraction or harvest, but in this restoration, and the importance of their presence, being at the table and making those decisions in good governance?
You want me to go first? Sure. It's a great question. It's one that we've been kind of like living and struggling to try and build over the last decade. And how do you get the rights holders to the table in a meaningful way when you have 200 plus nations across the province? You don't have 200 seats at the table. So nations need to get into a room and start talking about how do they bring their jurisdiction and authority to the table. How do they share that? What are the things they have in common? What kind of trust exists between nations? We see a lot of structures coming together now where nations are working in aggregate formats. They're working in tribal councils where they can kind of build on economies of scale and efficiencies to have people appointed to sit at some of these tables. The problem that we're seeing is there's not enough back-end resourcing from government and or private industry to ensure that the person sitting at the table is resourced enough to go back and communicate to the regions and the nations in that territory. They're asked questions at the table. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? In our teachings, in our high context cultures in the Indigenous world, we don't think as an individual. We don't go, I think. That's not our way. We have to think about our 7 generations. We have to think about our community. And it's inappropriate and disrespectful for us to just respond and say, I think, because we have to consider all of those things. So we've been talking about this to the federal government on, say, for example, the Pacific Salmon Commission. We need more resourcing to get people that are sitting at the table in the Pacific Salmon Treaty discussions. How do they go back and talk to the people back in their territories? How do they bring that message back? The U.S. tribes that are sitting at the Pacific Salmon Treaty, they're funded over close to $6 million a year. The number that we get in Canada for BC First Nations participation, 185,000. So it's barely enough to get to the meeting, get their per diem for the day, and then fly back home. There's no way that they're resourced to go back out and talk to their communities and go back to the table with an informed perspective. That's just one example. This happens in a number of tables over the year. That's why I started off the conversation with that cheat code about if you're going to make decisions that affect First Nations, they have the right to be first at the table, but that's only half of it. They have to develop the institutions to further that conversation forward. So if they want to have a committee or a commission or something else that they can meet and talk about those things, that's part of the job of resourcing that. So whether you're dealing with forestry, mining, fisheries, environmental protection, water security strategy, water security fund development, you got to kind of like backfill that necessary support for the nations to get to the table and advance their interests coherently in a structured way. So that's what I would say. Thanks.
And I've already stated that well, I'll add, it's not only mandatory for the province to engage with First Nations, I think it's the right thing to do. So I think that is, what I would add is, that we're on the right track. The BC, since bringing in DRIPA, is on the right track. I'll just note, I hope we don't go backwards on this. And I'm not talking about our party and our government. I'm talking about a bigger theme that seems to be out there, not just in BC, but in Canada, maybe North America. And that's a realization that we have to deal with. But I think in BC, we have developed over time certainty. I think you heard Dallas talking about it earlier, about the evolution of governance over decades has got us to the point we're at now, and we cannot step backwards. So I'm committed to that. Our government is committed to making those good decisions on the land and water with co-management at the table. And Jordan talked about trust, and I think that is absolutely critical. So how do you develop that trust? In my opinion, I believe it is respect and understanding. Those are critical ingredients for developing trust. If you don't have those, it's really, really hard to develop trust. From that trust, if you are able to build that, I think you are able to then make agreements that will be long-lasting. Those agreements must reflect those principles, and if they do, I think they will be longer lasting. And I just want to finish adding that I agree with Jordan's comment about ensuring that there is capacity for the partners at the table. That is absolutely critical, that there needs to be that capacity. So that is certainly a message I got from Jordan that I'll continue to bring back to my minister and premier to ensure that that be funded and be in place going forward, because I think that's absolutely critical if we're going to actually have solid land use agreements and water and restoration agreements.
And Barb, I'll just make a brief comment to build or follow up on these points from Finn and Jordan. I would say before I joined PSF, I spent about 25 years working for DFO. Me, the team I worked with, we worked really hard every day to do the best we could for salmon. But we would show up, we would get sent out somewhere, look at something, go back to our office, and then we go home, right? And we got sent all over the province, all over the region. But who should make the decision around what happens to salmon and what happens in a watershed? It probably shouldn't be a public servant who gets sent out to some community, some territory, some watershed. It should be the people that live there. It should be the people that get the benefits or endure the consequences of what happens. And so in terms of good governance, we've heard lots of talk this morning around things moving in that direction. We need to keep going, and it needs to become more accountable and place-based to the people that have the rights, to the people that have the knowledge, and to the people that should get the benefits and choose what the consequences and trade-offs are.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on that. I promised we wouldn't go over, so I got to be really fast, but I have to add to this discussion. We talk about jurisdiction. In the tables I sit at, I'm with both BC and Canada, as well as our nations. I see Crown hiding behind their jurisdiction when you talk about the ocean. The Indigenous perspective, holistic. You cannot separate. That land and sea is connected. So when you talk about who should lead this, Indigenous peoples, in partnership with Crown and industry, working together. I'm aware we've got some audience questions. It looks like something floated to the top, so I'll just address this one here. How much of the impact on salmon do you believe is due to BC watershed management versus ocean management, like commercial fishing, environment, pollution, climate change? Again, we get into that jurisdiction conversation. I don't think it's an easy answer other than all of it together. But I will turn it over to opposite side. Yeah.
Well, this is something that Jordan, Finn, and I, we could probably be up here till Sunday talking about if you gave us the time. I'll try to give a short and concise answer to it. The general consensus from scientists is the big thing that's affecting salmon productivity in British Columbia is what's happening in the ocean. Ocean productivity has definitely changed, and that's moving the dial in a big way. And our salmon populations have a lot that are doing much more poorly, but there are a few that are actually doing okay or even pretty good in that context. But what I would say in terms of looking at the rest of the question is we probably, at least in the short term, can't do anything about that. We can know that it's happening, but what we should be doing is saying, what are the things that we do have control over? What are the things that we can turn the dial up or down on to do everything we can to mitigate those effects that are out there in the ocean that we probably can't do anything about locally on a day-to-day basis? But we can do something about how much water do we take out of our streams? Are we ready to deal with climate emergencies? Do we have forestry tied to good watershed stewardship and good outcomes? We can do something about all of that, and I think the short answer would be let's look at the things we can do something about and do everything we can to turn them in favor of sustainable watersheds and sustainable salmon.
Barb, I'll add really quickly, I think, and Jason has laid it out, in terms of ocean issues, and then also the question talks about freshwater and freshwater management. And Barb, you mentioned jurisdiction, and that's very much been the case where DFO has been tasked with a lot of the ocean issues, and the province is looking at how things are managed on the land, and the two butt heads in terms of jurisdiction. But First Nations, in my opinion, have jurisdiction over both. So I think your comment about Indigenous-led solutions is definitely the way to go to bring that value back to those watersheds, back to the particular parts of the ocean that meet the islander lands that nations are on. And so Indigenous governance can lead the way to solving these problems, but it can't do it alone. It's a huge task addressing climate change or food production issues in the ocean. But as Jason said, and that's part of this panel, is talking about, well, what are the things that are in our control? Watershed restoration, part of a restoration economy. I think we can all, I hope we can all agree that restoring ecosystems, our watersheds, bringing salmon back is in all of our interests. And how we do that working together is, I think that's going to be, the way is embracing our jurisdiction and working together, not pointing fingers and saying, that's your responsibility, not ours. I think we all have to say, how can we be part of that? And I know with the province, the watershed security strategy, focusing specifically on water and watersheds, is certainly an area we can lean into.
Thank you very much. I am now over time.
Well,
I
that's
say very quickly,
If you're really quick.
in responding directly to the question, it's all of it. It's a death of 1,000 cuts. Salmon are facing a death of 1,000 cuts. It's all of the pressures, and that's something that we've been looking at for a long time. In terms of bringing First Nations Indigenous knowledge to the table, again, it's about how do 200 nations come together and start working in a coherent manner to provide responses and provide that guidance. That's the tough nut to crack.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your attention to this very important topic, and thank you to each of the panelists for your time and energies today.
All right. Well, thank you to Barb, Finn, Jordan, Jason. Everybody stick around. We're going to get started on our lunch program right away, so please keep your seats. And if you don't have one, I really encourage you to find one. We're just going to take a couple quick photos, and then we'll get started on that right away.